It is my sincere honor and privilege. I'm sorry, Mr. Cameraman, I'm going to make you work today because I'm going to walk all over the place. So I ask for your forgiveness in advance. My sincere honor and privilege to be here with you today. I think I've got a little bit more than 5 minutes, so I'm going to take my time. We're going to kind of walk through some things around how we support our students in this work, how we also think about implicit bias as it informs the work that we do. But before I get started, I want to stay in line with the recognition, hey, Danette, I see you back there, of recognizing some of the folks who have come up before me. Dr. Eduardo, I'm a big admirer of hers, and I'm a little biased here because she's my former student too, right? And so you know you've done well when your student is like doing better than you and smarter than you. So I've done well because I take your credit. So thank you so much, Dr. Eduardo. My dear colleague and my partner in crime, Dr. Tricia Lester, we work together at UCLA in the Pritzker Center for Strengthening Children and Families. Thank you for what you do. Nastasia, I got to shout out all my folks who I work with, right? So it's my sincere honor and privilege, as I said, and I'm going to use my time to really not talk at you as much as I would love to have you all sort of engage with each other around some of the topics that we're going to discuss today. Look, I am not going to try to play like I'm unbiased. I think that LA County is the best county in the whole world, so give LA County a shout out. I'm a product of LA County. Nobody can talk bad about LA County in my presence because that will not be a good outcome. I'm a defender of LA County. In particular, I'm a product of Compton, California. Where are my Compton folks at? I see Compton over there, okay? Don't talk about my city because that's my city, and we're my Linwood folks. Linwood is like our sister city, okay, Linwood. So I got some preferences in the county. I got to be honest. So Linwood and Compton. But part of what we have to recognize is that the work we do is so important because if you know, many of you know this, but if LA County was a state, it would be the 10th largest state in the country, right? The 10th largest state in the country, LA County. So when I go to other parts of the country and they tell me about how hard these problems are, like I was in Iowa recently. Iowa has 3 million people in the entire state. We have 10 million in LA County alone. So I'm like, don't tell me about your problems in Iowa. We got you beat 3 times over, right? So I have so much appreciation and respect for all the folks who are in this room because you're in the trenches, you're doing the heavy work, you're doing the hard lifting. And I think in many ways, if we get it right in LA County, we set a tone for the rest of the entire country because I think many of the challenges that we are facing, that we are struggling with, that we have solved and are continuing to solve, other states are just starting to think about these issues. So that's why I think we're at the forefront of this work, and I cannot say enough to all of you for what you do. So one of the things I always ask folks to do before I start, and you all know what I do, and if you've heard me talk before, I don't think that folks who are in this work get enough recognition for the tireless hours you invest in our young people. So if you don't mind, would you take like maybe 5 or 10 seconds max? Can you turn to your elbow partner and just let that person know that you thank them and you appreciate them for doing what they do? Just let them know. Thank you for doing what you do. Thank you for doing what you do. Lancaster, thank you for doing what you do. Okay, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for serving. Thank you for uplifting children. Thank you for advocating for families. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I want to start off today by talking about sort of the importance of community schools and why community schools matter. So I always think about this work from the standpoint of I mentioned earlier I was raised in Compton, but what was really unique about, not unique, but what was important about my upbringing, like I'm sure many in this room. So I was fortunate enough to have a mother and father who played very integral roles in my life. But my mom and dad worked a lot. So they did their job, but what really helped to make my childhood what it was is that there were other folks in the process who played a role as well. So Miss Thomas was a couple of doors down the street, and when my mom and dad were not there, Miss Thomas kept her eyes on us, right? And when I went to school, Mr. Smith was my PE teacher. He made sure if we weren't doing the things the right way, he would communicate with my parents about what we needed to be doing, right? And then Miss Russell was my 5th grade teacher. She was just like a mad woman in lots of ways, right? But she also stayed honest. And so much of what I say about my experience was the fact that there was the village. There were different people who played different roles to ensure that my upbringing and my brother's upbringing was what it was. So what I admire so much about what we're doing with community schools, it's a similar approach. We cannot expect schools to do this work alone. What we know is that the complex needs that our young people have are increasing by the day, and so we have to take a very different approach. And what community schools do, it recognizes the importance of families and communities. We cannot get this work done the right way without engaging from an asset-based standpoint the importance of families and communities. And please, what we cannot do is operate from the standpoint that says families and communities are in a deficit. I cringe when I hear people talk about we have to help save broken families. I'm not sure what broken families are and what they mean. Oftentimes people say broken families are families where children come from single-parent households. Not true. Where you have a single person like a grandparent raising kids. Not true. Let me tell you this. There are two-parent households that are highly dysfunctional, okay? And there are single-parent households that are highly functional. So part of what we must remember as we do this work, it is not the composition of the family that matters, it's the disposition of the family that matters, okay? So part of why this work is important because it operates from an asset-based standpoint that families and caregivers and parents matter and that they are an integral part of how we get this work done. So not only that, but we also recognize that schools also must partner with community agencies as well. We have a host of different community agencies doing important work. If we don't engage DMH, DCFS, DPH, we are missing out on huge opportunity to connect. Dr. Sharon talked earlier about the fact that his daughter is about to start her MSW. I also have a daughter who's starting her MSW at UCLA like next week, so I'm all in on her doing the important work, right? She said she wanted to be a social worker. I said, you need to get, this is the sheltered young lady, understand this, right? I said, you need to get a little experience first. So she spent a full year working in a group home for girls between the ages of 14 and 18 who are formerly incarcerated. If you do that, then you are ready for being a social worker, right? So she got baptism by fire, and after that, she was more involved in it because she realized the resilience of these young women. She realized the challenges and obstacles they face, and I cannot say enough about why she's smart. She didn't get it from me, she got it from her mother, right, for pursuing this work. So community schools operate from the standpoint of how can we focus on education and training, how can we talk about access to care, how can we put an explicit focus on activities, resources, and supports, and also, again, a very explicit focus on mental health. But part of what I want us to do, and I know you all recognize this, it's time for us to stop stigmatizing mental health. Okay, it's time for us to be upfront and bold about the fact that mental health matters. I got my amen corner over there. I hear you over there, right? Thank you very much, right? We have got to stop playing the game as if mental health is somehow a weakness. I think we have to recognize it's real. And if we were really honest, most of us, probably all of us in this room, have someone in our close proximity who's facing some mental health challenges. If we want to go one step further, I believe all of us probably need to be in some kind of therapy because the fact of the matter is, for us to be where we are requires just a little bit of examination, right? Okay? But anyway, the bottom line is we cannot stop, we have to stop avoiding this conversation. It's important, it matters, and that's why I think this work is important because we're talking about how we center this work in schools, and so how we engage parents, families, community members, community agencies to get this work done right, okay? So how are we going to do this today? So I want to share with you, I wish this was a little clearer. I'm a professor, so I'm into data, but I'm not bore you with a lot of data. But here are some recent graduation data we have from the County of Los Angeles, breaking down by race and ethnicity. So in addition to us having conversations about mental health, I think it's also important for us to have conversations about race. Because we don't like to talk about race, despite the fact that we should be talking about race. We're one of the most racially diverse counties in the entire world, but yet we're still not really willing to engage in what we think about race. And that's why implicit bias matters today. So if you can't see that, what I'll do is just give you a real quick rundown. What you see is that we have reached a record high, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Duardo, we have reached a record high in the number of students who are graduating from the county. But my grandmother always reminded me that the devil is in what? Details. So if we dig a little deeper, we see we have some disparate outcomes across racial and ethnic lines. So we see that we have African Americans are graduating across the county at about 75%. Our Latinx students are about 81%. Our white students 85%. Asian Americans 94%. Native Americans at 60%. Pacific Islanders at 83%. Our Filipinos at 91%, and then mixed race students at 82%. Okay, so that's our 17-18 data. So I need you to take 2 minutes. 2 minutes at your tables. I told you you're going to talk and engage. 2 minutes at your tables to talk about what stands out about those graduation rates and what important about these outcomes at your tables. 2 minutes. What stands out with you about these data, and what questions should we be asking? Please, 2 minutes. Okay, if we can come back together, please. So, the question was, based on these data, what questions should we be asking? So I hear from like 2 or 3 people about what you might have discussed at your table. What questions should we be asking when we see graduate outcomes broken down by race or ethnicity? Somebody, anybody, comments, questions that we should be asking. Now, I'm a former classroom teacher. I taught in Compton, so I will call on somebody. Okay, yes, please. That's right. That's right. That's right. Amen. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate that. Yes. Please help us out.
Hi. I would like to see the data disaggregated a little more in geographical location because by LA County, but as you mentioned before, LA County is quite large.
Yes.
So how is that distributed?
Yes. We need to have even more data than what we have here, right? So our data system needs to improve. I so appreciate that comment, and I agree with it. Yes, please. Yeah, so we have continued to see outcomes different across race and ethnicity. I think we need to continue to not let up until we get some viable sort of answers and then more viable interventions. I saw one more hand here, please.
Well, we were talking about here that those rates don't tell us the GPA. And currently, it seems like just graduating alone.
Just graduating alone is not really as important as your engagement in school, your efforts in school, what your GPA is, what your plans on.
How prepared you are.
Are you prepared to go on to something
for college
further?
And career. Yes.
And you know, they have things now like Apex just to be able to fill in the gaps, and you can graduate with a 1.2.
Yeah, this is a good point. So a lot more. Final comment on this side. Yes, please, talk to us. Yes, it is.
We also have a low rate in the African American culture. We have to be culturally sensitive, and we also discussed at our table the impact of generational trauma. And we are lacking somewhat in our ability to psychologically support our kids and mentor them through their educational career and prepare them for college.
Yes.
Because when I talk to college educators, so many kids are not prepared for their college education.
Amen. I got papers I read every week that can testify to that, right? So here's the bottom line though. So I appreciate your comment. But it's not ironic, folks, if we look at the 3 groups that are the lowest, they are the 3 groups who have experienced some of the most horrific types of historical trauma in this country. So the fact that, for example, Native Americans are the lowest should not come as a surprise when we understand the history of what has happened with the decimation of Native Americans in this country. When we look at the outcomes for African Americans, we cannot divorce that from the realities of what slavery and Jim Crow and all that has meant to that population. When we look at the outcomes for our Latinx population, we cannot dismiss that or separate that from the sort of role that we know that conquest and taking of lands has had on those populations and the historical trauma that still exists to this day. So part of what we have to do, I just use this as a talking point because what tends to happen in many of our spaces, people see these data and we're quick to blame students or families or cultures or communities. And we cannot allow that kind of deficit language to be the way in which we begin to even start the conversations. I'm asking us, and that's why this work is so important, to operate from an asset-based standpoint. When you understand some of the historical traumas that those groups have gone through, the fact that the numbers are that high is a testimony to the resilience, strength, determination, and focus of those groups. So this work has to operate from an asset-based standpoint that recognizes that there's nothing wrong with the students. I think we must question some of the structures that serve them. You all with me on that? Okay, so let's go one step further. No. So part of what we have to think about, how do we take a more cumulative disadvantage approach to this work? So that's why the work around community schools is so important, because we can't just sort of put this responsibility solely on any one population. We can't say schools, you got to fix it. We can't say mental health folks, you got to fix it. We can't say education services, you got to fix it. It requires a multi-pronged approach. Intersectional in nature, which looks at disadvantage across the county, because it's not only economic. I appreciate the comment about how oftentimes it's tied to food and access to nutrition. It's about housing instability, which we'll talk about in a second. But we require a much more multifaceted approach to deal with complex problems. What we oftentimes do is try to use singular approaches to multi-layered problems. It can't work that way. And then we do what my grandmother said. You know, how many of you have a grandmother who has all these sayings, right? My grandmother had this saying that the surest sign that you're crazy is doing what? The same thing over and over again and not getting a different result. So that's why this work is so important. I applaud the county and DMH and all the folks involved that said we have to take a much more intersectional approach. Now, as we do, part of the focus is on this, what I call the equity-focused trifecta, okay? Understanding and examining poverty, also understanding the role of race and racism, and then also looking at the role that trauma plays in this as well. Okay? So I don't think we can look at those separate from one another. Many of you have read the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, who talks about sort of intersectionality and how we have to look at the ways in which poverty and race and trauma have an impact. We see our women of color are harmed by this perhaps more than any other population. So I think we have to take a much more critical approach. Now, I'm asking us to be mindful of this, though, because everybody uses this term equity. It's like the new buzzword, equity, right? I oftentimes refer to equities like the new coconut water. Everybody says they love coconut water, right? That stuff is terrible. I can't say, I disrespect to those of you who like it. It looks like dishwater to me, but everyone says that they love coconut water, but I don't see a lot of people drinking coconut water. And I think equity is similar, because people say we believe in equity, we do equity, equity is the right thing to do. Equity is not an add-on. Equity is not a program. Equity is not an intervention. Equity is not a curriculum. I believe that equity is a consciousness. Equity is an awareness. Equity is a way of life. Equity is a way that we understand structural disadvantage. And equity is different, and this is what we must continue to stress, than equality. Folks oftentimes use those terms interchangeably, right? If equity and equality were the same, that means equality says we give everybody the same thing. If we give everybody the same thing, guess what we still have? Inequities. So I think equity is bold and revolutionary, because equity says that we're going to be very intentional and unapologetic about giving more to those who have historically received less. Let me say that again. Giving more to those who have historically received less. And that alone is going to cause lots of people to cringe, because they're going to say, that's not fair. Well, guess what, folks? We're not playing the fair game. The fair is something they have in Pomona once a year in October. And so that's what we're talking. We're talking about equity. Equity says that, look, if we're going to play the fair game, you know what's not fair? Sexism is not fair. Racism is not fair. Homophobia is not fair. Xenophobia is not fair. So if we're going to play the fair game, we got a lot of things we can put on the table to say it's not fair that explains the outcomes that our students have. So it reminds me of a conversation I was having with the superintendent in another state just a couple of months ago. And we were having this conversation about equity. And she just could not wrap her head around it. She said, why would we give more to those who have gotten less? That's just kind of giving them unfair advantages. That's not giving them the kind of agency that they need. And I was like worried. I'm like, you're a superintendent and you believe this? What does your district look like, right? And so we went back and forth for a while trying to come to an agreement about how equity matters in a way that equality doesn't quite get at. So we never got to the point of agreement. So I said, okay, let's agree to disagree. And I kept thinking about what could I have explained to her that would have possibly helped her to understand this concept. And so you know how you have these late night ideas, like at 1 in the morning, they kind of hit you, right? So here's the example that came to mind. So how many of us have been to like a big public event, like a concert or a sporting event? Show of hands. Okay, right. How many of us have been to those events and we've had to go to the restroom? Okay, raise your hands. Okay. I hear some of you laughing. Why are we laughing? What's the thing that comes to mind when we go to restrooms? Okay, the lines. Okay, does this look familiar right here? Okay. How many times have we been at an event and the line for the women is a mile long and the line for the men is like folks are going in and out with no problem, right? And I cannot tell you how many times I've been out with my wife and she's in that line and she'll see me go in and out the restroom and then she'll say, let me ask you a question. Is anybody in that restroom right now, right? Because I'm going in. Stand cover for me, right? Now, okay, I use this as an example to say, is this equity or is this equality? This is equality. You all smart group. This is equality because we have a restroom for men and we have a restroom for women. They get the same thing. And I'm arguing that the same thing does not always work for everybody, right? And this is what we do oftentimes in education. Let's give everybody the same thing despite the fact that people have different needs. Now, here's what we would never do. Here's what we would never say. We would never say, you know what, ladies? Your line is long because you just need to get in that restroom and work a little harder and get in there and get out. We would not say that, right? What we would not say is, men, your line is shorter because you are just smarter, you work harder, you get in and you get out, right? We don't say, ladies, stop whatever you do in that stall and handle your business and keep it moving, right? We would not blame the women, nor should we blame the women, right? Part of what we recognize is that this structure does not serve the needs of women in a way that it serves the needs of men. Nothing wrong with the women, something's wrong with the structure. You follow me on that? Now I'm asking, what if we use that same analogy with regard to our students? If we said there's nothing wrong with our students, maybe there's something wrong with the structure, right? I think our students show up to us with some of the most amazing intellect, resilience, work ethic, creativity, imagination, but somehow we stifle that and we snuff that out because we say that we want them to fit in these nice, neat little boxes, and they're telling us, you know, I don't fit in that box. That box does not define me. So I'm asking us, instead of blaming students, let's ask ourselves about how the structures that we all are part of can serve them differently, okay? Not blaming students and families, but taking a close look at what we do, okay? Does that make sense to folks, the restroom analogy? So I'm asking, this is our current structure when it comes to restrooms, one of equality. But what if the restroom structure looked like this? Okay, ladies, are you with me on that, right? Okay, what if she like, yeah, I'm all in on that, right? Sign me up. For every one restroom that men had, there was 3 for women. We wouldn't have the lines, right? We'd all be happier, okay? So I'm saying, is this fair? She said, yeah. Is it equal? And you got to have neutral too, right? Okay, check me on that. We got to have neutral too. Amen. Okay, I got you on that. But the reality is our current structure does not meet the needs of everybody. And the current structure of our students, of our schools, doesn't meet all of our students' needs, okay? So part of what I ask us to think about is the following. Let's talk about poverty for a second. We have 10 million students who live in poverty in this country. There are 3 million students who live in what's called extreme poverty. Okay, we must understand the way that poverty has a profound influence on the way young people experience school, and it has an impact on mental health and well-being as well, right? When we say extreme poverty, what are we talking about? The data from the U.S. Census Bureau tells us that it's a family of 4 or more on an income of $10,000 a year or less. Okay, help me out. Where are my math folks here in the room? $10,000 a year is how much a month? It's like not enough, right? Somebody said less than 1,000. That's my kind of math, right? Okay. Okay. That's the Compton math I got, right? Okay. Okay. So $10,000. $1,000. I'm sorry. What? $10,000 a year is $830 some odd dollars a month. $833 a month. Folks, we live in Los Angeles County. Okay, where average rents in the county. We looked this up because the other school across town had a report on this. Average rents in the county of Los Angeles are about $1,600 a month. Average, $1,600. Now, if you're making $833 a month, and average rents are $1,600 a month, how much do you have after you pay your rent? Help me out. Come on, folks, work with me. Carry your 1, bring down your 2, right? So we're laughing, but the reality is the following, that there are a number of students right here in our county whose families struggle to make ends meet just to keep a roof over their head, right? And so when we look at what the poverty looks like in the county, we know that approximately 1 million students in the county, across Los Angeles, are in poverty, right? And if you look at the adjusted poverty index, some consider that number to be higher because part of what McKinney-Vento does not take into consideration is the whole notion of doubling up. Okay, and there are a lot of students and families who are in doubled up situations where they may not be on the streets or in shelters like many other families are, but they are living with friends or family members, which brings its own level of anxiety and tension and challenges. Because how many of us have opened our home up to a family member who says we just need to stay someplace for like 2 weeks, right? I see some of you laughing because 2 weeks means what? 1 year, right? Right? And how many times, and we're laughing, but we've all been there. Okay, we're going to open up our house for 2 weeks. It turns into a year. There have been days where you come home from work, you're tired, you walk into your house, and somebody's sitting on your couch, your remote control, eating your ice cream, right? You're like, okay, this is not fun anymore. This is getting to be a challenge. And so there are lots of children who have stressors associated with the effects of poverty and housing insecurity and the like. To understand that when we look at poverty across Los Angeles County, we are still very segregated in different parts of the county. So if you look at the part of the map on the right, it shows you LA County, and it shows you where the highest levels of poverty are. And you see the highest levels of poverty happen in the southern parts of the county, South LA, parts of East LA, even South LA County like San Pedro. But then there's a part of the county I think we overlook, and I think we should be explicit in focusing on Northern County. Where my Lancaster, Palmdale folks at? Okay? I think sometimes we overlook Palmdale, Lancaster, but we see the highest rates of poverty in the county in the Antelope Valley. We see the highest rates of foster care in the Antelope Valley. So what we must understand is that our approaches to be intersectional must also be geographically intentional. Because part of what you notice on that map, if you see where the lowest rates of poverty are in LA County, they're all across that coastal part of the county, right? All the cities that end with beach, Redondo Beach, Hermosa Beach, right? That's where we see a lot less poverty, and we also tend to see fewer folks of color in those parts of the county. So when I talk to my friends who live in those parts of the county, all the beaches, I keep telling them, just be careful because it's a matter of time before we come. We're coming there, right? We will find a way. Sometimes we stay away from the water, but then guess what? We're going to find a way to get there because this is what we do, move, right? So understand that we're still a very segregated county. Even though we're diverse, we're highly segregated. And so part of what we have to do when we think about these intersectionality approaches is be intentional about where the poverty is deepest and how do we put those resources. That's why I love the fact that we're talking about wellness centers across the county, because parts of South LA, East LA, Antelope Valley are desperately in need of those supports and services. When I'm out in Antelope Valley, part of what I continue to hear from educators is that we need more services. We need more supports. Our families should not have to travel from Lancaster all the way down to Los Angeles for supports, especially when you don't have transportation, especially when you've got 2 or 3 kids you've got to also tend to, right? So there's issues of geography, of transportation, of poverty, and again, who's most affected? Oftentimes women of color who are the ones who are feeling the brunt of those kinds of circumstances, okay? So I'm asking us to be mindful of what the homeless population looks like across LA County. I think we have to look at that broken down by race and ethnicity. The data we have from the county, though, does not give us specific data that speaks to the gender breakdown of homelessness, because what we know is that it tends to be single women who are oftentimes experiencing disproportionate homelessness in our county, but we also know that there's some, I'm going to have a microphone, this is going in and out. We also see that there is some racial disproportionality. Thank you, sir. There's some racial disproportionality that African Americans are overrepresented when it comes to housing insecurities. So again, when we talk about what these community-based interventions look like, housing stability is critical. Then we go one step further. One of the things we're concerned about are foster students who are in foster care. And again, LA County leads the entire nation in terms of the number of young people who are in care. We have over 30,000 young people who are in care. And again, what I'm concerned about is how we support all students who are in care. But one of the things I'm curious about is why some groups, in particular, one group African Americans are overrepresented when it comes to their representation in foster care. So, for example, African American students are about a quarter of the young people who are in foster care, despite the fact that they only make up about roughly 8 or 9% of the county's population. And what we are seeing now in the area of social welfare is this whole process of what's called blind removal. How do we take a case of one family and a case of another family, and when we take race or ethnicity out, we see that the ways in which those families are responded to are very similar. But then when we put race into the equation, we see that black and brown families are oftentimes judged in a much harsher fashion than white or Asian families would be. That's where the bias matters, because we should not be judging families based on skin color or socioeconomic status. But what we know across the county, and we were just yesterday at the hotline training at DCFS, and part of what we heard is that there's an ongoing need to make sure that all social workers are being trained around implicit bias. Because what you see with one family, if it looks like another family situation, but because this family has more socioeconomic resources, we tend to not think about removal, but because this family is poor, we think those kids need to be taken away because those families are inadequate. That cannot happen, right? That should not happen. Or if you've got a white family who's got similar situations as a black or brown family, but yet the white family is given supports and interventions, whereas the black and brown family has children removed, that should not be happening. So we have to have hard conversations, folks. We have to talk about what it means to create more equitable types of experiences for all of our families and children. And this is where schools and mental health can all be at place in making sure we come up with viable solutions, okay? So, okay, you got to turn and talk. So I need you to talk at your tables for 2 minutes. What are the services and supports that are in place to support students in care and students experiencing homelessness that you are seeing? And a simple question, are they effective, and how do you know? So 2 minutes. What's being done where you are around students in foster care and students experiencing homelessness, and are they working? Okay, hear a lot of good things being discussed. If we can come back together, please. So, why this work? One of the reasons why this work is important is because we're recognizing that there are factors outside of home that have a profound influence, outside of school, I should say, that have a profound influence on what happens inside our schools. So let me hear from a couple of folks. What are we seeing? What are we doing around students in foster care or students who are experiencing homelessness in our respective districts? And how do we know that they're effective? Because just because we're doing something doesn't mean that it's impactful. And so we need to be very mindful of what evidence, what data we're collecting to ensure it. Please, talk to us.
Hi, we're here from Linwood High School, and we do have a homeless liaison. And my colleague and I, we work with the homeless and the foster youth at our site. And what we were talking about is the fact that we do have a lot of services that we do provide and try to reach out, but we do have a lot of families that will not fess up to the fact that they're foster or that they're homeless. So we have no way of knowing if the services are effective because they will not accept the services because of all, like you said, the outside. We have a lot of migrant families that are afraid. They don't know how the system works, and so they will not accept the services because they don't know.
Yes. No, thank you, Shanette. Please.
I'm coming from the perspective of a parent, and so I know that every year when I have to do registration for my children, there's a form that asks, are you homeless? Are you a farm worker and things of that sort? And so I always think in my mind, why would I put on there that I'm homeless when I don't know what type of services this is going to bring to me? I don't know if there's any follow-up with that. And so thinking about Department of Children and Family Services, I don't want to put on there that I'm homeless and then you call on me and it's a possibility I could get my children detained.
Or what if I'm undocumented?
Yes, or I'm
right?
undocumented.
That's a big one, right.
So it's very scary. The other thing is that, in LA County, we have the Coordinated Entry Service, and so that is a database for homeless people, and it's, based on a vulnerability. Why aren't those systems there at our schools.
Yeah.
So that if someone does put that on there, they can get into this database and help them and get services. We don't have that. So
Yeah, these are important
I don't know
points.
how effective.
So I hear a couple of things. One is that we have to figure out some ways that allows people to come forward without the sort of fear that's oftentimes associated with this process, the uncertainty associated with the process, and also the stigmatization that occurs with being in one of these groups. And so we have to find some ways that are supportive, that are transparent. I talk to a lot of school districts and I ask teachers, tell me who your homeless liaison is. The majority don't even know that they have a homeless liaison, let alone do they understand the resources that the homeless liaison can offer. So I'm asking us to be more intentional about making sure that our staff, paraprofessionals, counselors, everyone at the school building is aware that they have homeless liaisons who can provide services. I see a hand over here. Talk to us, please.
One of the issues that we have, too, is they're not technically homeless, but a lot of kids, particularly LGBTQ, get kicked out of their house when they come out, or if they're drug use or involved in gang activity or something. The parents are like, I don't want you in my house. And we know those kids are living on. We can't access services for them. And we can't get them anything without parent permission.
Yeah,
and then we're in that.
So it's tricky, right? And I think that's a great point. I think one of the populations that we have not been as intentional in terms of supporting our LGBTQ students. What we must remember, folks, is that we have data now from the Gay, Straight, Lesbian Education Network database that tells us that the leading cause of death, the leading cause of death for LGBTQ youth between the ages of 12 and 17 is what? Suicide. So we have to ask ourselves, how do we put mental health supports in place? How do we put housing supports in place? How do we put food supports in place? Because there are a lot of our young people who have been shunned by their families, who are being shunned by their schools. And if we have young people feeling like there's no other way out other than to take their lives, then we have all failed as a system. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that, and I think we have to be very intentional and equitable in making sure that we focus on those groups who have been historically overlooked, okay? One other comment on what we're doing, what we're seeing. Please.
I have a comment on what you just shared around LGBTQ.
Yes.
Thank you. I think that, I don't know, a conversation around culture and like, for families, for example, I'm Caribbean, Belizean, and in that culture, LGBTQ, if you go to that country, it's not accepted. And so how do we have conversations with families like that? Maybe they're like, oh, I'm so scared, like my daughter is coming out, or because that's traumatic for them. So I think we need to be use trauma-informed care on both sides for the young people affected, but their families as well, because they're not necessarily trying to show stigma, but they don't know any better. And you also have to respect culture in that some cultures will never accept that child, and I hate to be that real about it, but how do you still show that parent or their family to foster love? So that's the real question. I think it has to be treatment on both ends.
Right, no, so I agree, but I think so if we're honest for a second, folks, I think this point is a good one because homophobia is rampant across all communities, but if we are honest, I think that in many ways, communities of color, homophobia is probably even more rampant. Transphobia is probably even more rampant. And this is another one of our unspoken dialogue that we don't have conversations about the ways in which in our families, in our communities, we still operate from the standpoint that we're just going to pray that this person becomes un-lesbian. Like, what is that, right? Or we're going to pray that this person becomes un-gay, right? What is that? I think we have to have these conversations with parents and caregivers and families to respect culture, but also to understand that there are ways in which young people are trying to be their authentic selves, but we are not allowing that to happen. So this is why this work is important and why it must be intersectional. So thank you for the comment. So let's also make sure that we all know about these adverse childhood experiences. Everybody here should know this, and I think we have to continue to talk to all of our service providers about the ways in which we see physical, emotional, sexual abuse that's happening across all socioeconomic status. Let's be clear, issues of abuse also happen in well-to-do families as well. Let me say this again. Abuse happens in well-to-do families as well. Part of the bias piece that comes into play is that we think issues around abuse only happen in poor families. That is not the case. We just acknowledge it, right? In more affluent communities, it's much more sort of kept under, recognize and understand that all these issues around neglect are real, Parental mental illness. We learned yesterday during our visit to the DCFS hotline that one of the more sort of recent occurrences, not recent, but we're becoming more aware of, is that the kinds of general neglect that's happening of children because parents who have mental health issues and they're not in the best position to service their children. I also learned too, DCFS hotline takes in 260,000 calls a year. 260,000 calls. About 60,000 of those are ultimately investigated. What we learned is that the number one group of folks who call into the hotline on behalf of students, young people, are who? Educators, teachers, principals, counselors, the folks that you all are interacting with every single day. So you must continue to stress to your staffs that they are mandated reporters. If they are suspicious, if they see something, say something. It's best to make a call and be told that it doesn't rise to the level of investigation as opposed to not acting at all, and then you have a child's well-being and safety being compromised. So we must understand these different childhood experiences in terms of how they are affecting students, and we still have these young people who show up in our schools every single day. They still show up in our classrooms every single day. And if many of you took the time out to understand, I mean, social workers in the house right now? Okay, you all know this, so all y'all get this, right? So my wife was a children's social worker for like 20 plus years, and she would bring these cases home that would literally bring you to tears. You all have seen these cases of what young people are going through in ways that we cannot even fathom. And so part of what we have to recognize is not, again, feel sorry for students, but understand and recognize the resiliency that they show to still show up, trying to be whole, trying to be human, trying to be children in the face of some different types of adversities, okay? So how does it play out in our classrooms, folks? I always tell you, your folks have to know and recognize the 3 Fs, right? The fight, the flight, and the freeze. And I think what we have to stop doing is punishing students when we see this type of behavior. I think oftentimes when we have the effects of trauma manifesting in schools, we tend to punish, which only makes the matter worse. So on the flight side, I am hearing from more principals and more teachers and seeing, in some cases, more students who now just get up and walk out of classrooms, right? Who get up and run out of classrooms, right? And we're quick to think that there's bad behavior or parents are not able to control their children. We must understand the ways in which young people are being triggered in our classrooms, because part of what we don't talk about is that we have a number of teachers who have their own unresolved traumas. And then we have the traumatized traumatizing the traumatized, if that makes sense, right? And so that's why this work is so critical, to have supports at schools so we don't have adults who are triggering their students, okay? We see the fight playing itself out where students are acting in different ways that suggest that perhaps there's some other unresolved issues that are taking place. And then we have the freeze approach, where we see young people who are there physically, but not there emotionally, not there in sort of cognitive ways. And I think we have to begin to see these behaviors as perhaps they may be signs that something may have happened to our students, and not be quick to sort of label this behavior. Because if you look at one of the primary reasons why we're suspending students in schools, it tends to fall in one of these 3 categories. And I'm asking us to rethink this approach, because pushing students out of schools in some cases is only making the problem worse. So again, a more asset-based, trauma-informed care approach would recognize that the fight, the flight, and the freeze may be an indication of something deeper happening. And so instead of us pushing those kids out, we need to be bringing them closer to us to ask ourselves the question, what types of support should we have in place in order to support those students and their families? Does it make sense to everybody? Okay. Do we see the 3 Fs in our schools? How often do we see it? Like the first 20 minutes of the day sometimes, right? Okay. Now, so what does the trauma-informed approach have to look like? It's a program or organization that is trauma-informed. Look, I should have Dr. Lester here. She's the expert on this, right? And Nastasia has to have the following pieces. It realizes the impact of trauma and understands that there is a path to recovery, that we can help support students and their families get better. We have to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma when we know it. I think we're still operating from the standpoint of not seeing and understanding trauma, not seeing it through a pathological lens, but seeing it from a real sort of systematic, structural standpoint of how and why it happens. I think we have to respond by fully integrating what we know in terms of our policies, practices, and procedures. Again, policies, practices, and procedures. This is not, again, an add-on, just like I talked about with equity. It has to be something that's integrated in what we do. And we have to seek to actively resist re-traumatization. This is why I think we have to have more of an intentional focus on our caregivers at home and in our schools, because again, you all know, look, the work on secondary traumatic stress is real, vicarious trauma. We're also looking at intergenerational trauma. How many times have we seen a student and we ask the question, why does that student behave that way? Why does that student behave that way? Why does that student behave that way? And then the parent shows up, and then you know why the student behaves that way, right? Because this doesn't go away just because we get older. If anything, the trauma becomes more complex over time. And so again, our approaches must be centered in, again, an asset-based standpoint, okay? All right, so what are some of the core principles of trauma-informed practice? Strengths-based, we're gonna keep talking about that. Strengths-based, understanding of and responsive to the impact of trauma. Safety is critical here because, again, one of the things that we're trying to help our young people recognize that there are supports in place that can help to ensure their safety. And then we also know from the literature on trauma that when young people have a sense of control and empowerment, that that is a pathway to recovery and helping students begin to heal from the types of situations that they might be going through. So again, strengths-based, being trauma-informed and aware, understand the cultural, historical, and gender issues that might be at play here. That's a part that I think we oftentimes are missing from some of our trauma-informed approaches, and I think in some communities, this work has to look and feel different than it might in other communities, okay? Safety has to be a priority. Trust has to be there. We also need to make sure that there's empowerment and choice and that there's collaboration. That's what this work is all about, to make sure we have these critical pieces in place. Thank you, Nastasia, for your work on this. In terms of helping us to recognize what trauma-informed practice needs to look like. This is not something that we should be doing just on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 2 to 3. This is something that should be in place every single day. It should be sort of ingrained in the fabric of what we're offering in all of our sites on a regular basis, okay? Questions, comments? Let's talk more about the implicit bias side of this now, okay? So implicit bias, this is the piece that we have to begin to understand how this thing called bias that we all have that affects the ways in which we see people and situations and circumstances. And I'm a little bit concerned that when we think about who it is that needs supports, we kind of have a different type of lens we use for some of our students and families compared to others. And bias work says we need to call that to the surface. But the bias is so ingrained in us, sometimes we don't recognize that we have it. And so the goal is to, A, try to bring the unconscious to the conscious so we can make better choices and provide better supports, okay? So let's go through a couple of different tasks real quick. Let me show you this. How about we read together, starting with number 1. Let's read out loud together. What do we see? Let's read them together. Green. Yeah, keep going. You're good. Okay. Good job. Give yourselves a pound on the back. You did a nice job on that, okay? Now, I want you to read on this slide right here the color. Let's go together. The color, starting with column 1. Let's go. Nice and loud. The color. Yo. That didn't sound as good, folks, okay? Did not sound as good because we get socialized to do this, right? We see color, we associate the word with it. But when I ask you to step outside of your, step outside of your comfort zone and to do it this way, we're quick to think about how we read the word and not see the color. So that's what implicit bias is about. How do we shift our mental models? How do we shift our mental model to not always fall to the default that tells us something about a certain population, okay? We're gonna go a little bit deeper to understand how we are all guilty of doing that if we're not careful. So what does implicit bias do? It's historical, it's societal, it's programmed through culture, through media. We get a lot of this from our families. We grow up with it. It's in the air. We breathe it every single day, okay? And I'm gonna show you in a moment how we breathe and how we sort of operate on some of these notions. It lives in our schemas. We have experiences, and those experiences form schemas, and then we try to fit things into our existing schemas. If they don't fit into our schemas, then we try to somehow accommodate them in other ways. And again, it's important for all of us in a society to be mindful of this, but particularly important for us as folks who are in the service world. who are providing work to young people who fit into these categories. And part of what I stress is that being biased doesn't make you prejudiced, it just makes you a human being. Because some folks feel bad because they have biases. The goal is to work towards undoing the bias, okay? So then what does this look like? It has implications for behavior and what we do. So with racial biases, for example, we know that the amygdala is activated, which puts us in a fear response. So if there's somebody or something who represents a group that we have been socialized to believe is somebody or something we should be fearful of, we automatically go into our fear mode. I raise this because there are a lot of classroom teachers, though they would never admit it, but they are outright fearful of some of their students, right? And it's not because the students have done anything harmful to them, but if they've bought into a stereotype about a particular group of students, they are operating from fear where they just take hands off and they don't do or say anything that might be best suited for that student or the students in that classroom, because the amygdala has activated saying fear. I should not confront, I should not approach, let me just let that student do what he or she, and sometimes this happens as early as kindergarten, first grade, second grade, fear. We also know that the data tells us that there are oftentimes lower performance ratings, that we tend to, again, rate some students lower because they might fall into certain categories. So if we think language learner, many folks automatically assume slow learner. If we hear homeless student, we automatically assume not as prepared. If we think a child is being raised by a grandmother and grandfather, we tend to think there's no family support. All these sort of default sort of mechanisms kick in ways that we're not conscious of that doesn't give students an opportunity to be their best. Then we also know that sometimes that what the bias does, it moves us to avoid the other group, right? So because we think this group is X or this group is Y, we don't want to be around that group, despite the fact that we've never had a single negative experience with that group. We've heard about them, right? Like how many of us have said, you know, my best friends, sisters, cousins, uncles told me that those people act that way, right? No firsthand experience of that group, but we will avoid the other group because of the stereotype that we've allowed to inform our thinking, okay? Got to challenge that, have to change that. And then oftentimes we know there's more negative interactions that we have, again, based on the stereotype that we've ingrained. Now, part of what we know from the research on stereotyping always has a kernel of truth to it, okay? But part of the problem is that with stereotyping, we don't just take the kernel of truth and just tie it to one person. We take that kernel of truth and we do what? We generalize to everyone. And some groups have that generalization in a much more damning way than others, okay? And we'll talk about that in a second. Now, we know that some of this work happens early on. You should know the work of Walter Gilliam, who talked about the fact they looked at bias with preschool teachers. Preschool teachers, how old are our children in preschool? 4, 3 and 4 years old. So that means our children, our babies, have only been on the planet for 36 months, 48 months. We're already labeling them as being problems. And what we know, again, disproportionately, black and brown boys are more likely to be seen as troublemakers, more likely to be seen as being defiant, more likely to be seen as prone to not learning. So if that's the stereotype that we're operating on with certain students, guess what? If this is what you believe about children over time, it starts to become what? A self-fulfilling prophecy, okay? So we know that teachers are less likely to respond to empathy when a child of care is different from him or her. What we tend to do, whether we recognize it or not, is gravitate toward that which is most like us, that which we are most familiar with, that which we most recognize, right? And we do that because our schemas have told this is something that gives us a degree of safety. But that is different from us. Many of us, if we're not careful, we tend to think that's something I must keep at arm's length, or I have to watch it and be more suspicious of it because it may do or they may respond in ways that I think the stereotype has told me, okay? So, quick turn and talk. How might implicit bias affect the experiences and outcomes of our students, and how might supports and services be compromised by implicit bias, and what steps can we take? 2 minutes to talk about these questions around bias. All right, let's talk about it, folks. My time is getting short. So let's hear from a couple of people. How might bias affect our students? Somebody, anybody. How might bias affect the way our students experience what they receive in our schools and the kinds of supports? How might bias affect our students? Somebody. Talk to us, please.
I think it affects them tremendously because what you're doing, you're affecting their worldview.
Come on now.
A lot of times, not a lot of times, most of the time our children, especially when they're in more diverse schools, this is their experience with the community and with how the world may look like to them. And so if they're experience this at an early time from people who are in leadership, from teachers, then you're already setting them up. And so now they're going to have a bias when they go out into the world. So it just kind of trickles down. Yes. It definitely affects.
Thank you for sharing. One more person. Please talk to us.
What I've noticed is a lot more, in terms of the outcomes for students, that there's a lot more involvement with police, with school-age children, more than I've ever seen before, opposed to it being handled by a dean or a principal. There's a lot more involvement, even with elementary and the junior, Yeah,
you mentioned this. So a good friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Bryant Marks, has been doing implicit bias training across all of Los Angeles County. I sat in on one of his sessions where he did implicit bias training with police officers. And I was blown away by the ways in which police officers, men and women who were given the responsibility of protecting and serving, and most of them do it phenomenally well. But the biases that came up when they talked about certain communities, the things that they said about certain individuals was deeply, deeply disturbing. And my thing is, if these are the kinds of attitudes that you express about black and brown folks, about poor folks, about certain communities, how do you think then folks would respond to you if they have an interaction with you, right? So it has a profound impact on all of us, and we have to be mindful of the fact that the supports that we have in place are being aware of the ways in which our biases can affect the delivery of services, the quality of services, who we offer services to, who we invite into those spaces, what parents and caregivers we never even think to ask if they might be worthy or willing to participate in this. All this stuff is a part of our processes that we need to be conscious of, okay? So some takeaway points is that we have to recognize that implicit bias is distinct from conscious motivation, right? These are not things that we're oftentimes intending to do, but this is the bias. We have these biases due to cultural exposure. They can affect they can affect behavior unless we override them, and I'm gonna give you a few suggestions we can take in a minute to override these biases. And they can be changed with awareness, education, and exposure. Awareness, education, and exposure. So to that end, I recommend that everybody who has not done it or take the IAT test, the Implicit Association test, because I have folks we work with who say, I'm not biased, I'm not biased. We have science now that can prove it, right? He said, I'm not biased, yes. Yes, you are. And it's not just racial bias. We also have gender bias. We have age bias. We have weight bias. We have body type bias, right? Listen, we have teachers who we work with, we ask them to bring their devices. They take the Implicit Association test. They see their results. They get mad at me because their results come back showing that they have anti-black, anti-brown bias. They say the instrument is garbage, is flawed. I say, okay, we'll take it a second time. They take it a second time, the results come back worse the second time. And I tell them that being biased doesn't make you a bad person, it just makes you a human being. And we're trying to bring the unconscious to the conscious. So that's my homework assignment for everyone here. Take about 20, 25 minutes, because again, it's not just based on race and gender, also sexual orientation, religious preference, the whole 9 yards. We are all biased. Tell your elbow partner, you are biased. Tell him, you are biased. But you don't have to stay that way, okay? You don't have to stay that way. You are biased, I am biased, we're all that way, okay? All right, real quick before we wrap up, let me show you a real quick example to show you how I know you're biased. Let's take a trip real quick, a real quick activity, okay? You ready? Got a math problem for you. I'm gonna show your bias in real time, okay? All right, here we go. I need everybody in the room to pick a number between 1 and 5. You got your number? Got your number? Real quick, between 1 and 5. You got your number? Okay, now I need you to multiply that number by 9. Okay, take a little time, multiply by 9. You got your number now? Okay, she's like, I see her counting on her fingers, okay? Okay, multiply by 9. Now, that number that you have, if your new number is 2 digits, add them together. If it's just 1, use that number, okay? So you still got your number? Good. You like a smart group here, okay? Now, I need you to subtract 5 from that number. Take 5 from that number, okay? Multi-step math problem. Let's see how good you all are, okay? Okay, now you got your number. Now I need you to convert your number to a letter. If your number is 1, your letters A, 2, B, 3, C, 4, D, 5, E. So now you don't have a number, you have a what? Letter. Okay, you guys are a good group. Okay, now that you have your letter, I need you to real quickly identify a country that begins with that letter. 3 seconds, 3, 2, 1, think of a country real quick. Okay, now you got your country. Now, take the last letter of that country that you just chose. Okay, I get you. Wait. Okay, take the last letter of that country you just chose and think of an animal that begins with that letter. Got it? Okay, now you got it. Okay, next, we're almost done. Now, using the last letter of that animal you just chose, pick a color that begins with that letter. So now you got a country, you got an animal, and you got a color, right? Everybody got it? I'm going to show you a bias. About 80% of you in this room, of you in the room just chose this right here. Did you not? Did I get you here? Right? She said, no, not me, right? But many of you had the Denmark, you had a kangaroo. You had that, huh? See, I showed you that quick. She said, no, you didn't have it, huh? Okay. Now, you like that one, okay? We are all biased. We are all biased. We are all biased. I might not have got some of you who chose the Dominican Republic as your country, but most of you chose Denmark as your country, right? And most of you found kangaroo. We're all biased. Let's work on it, okay? So, now, what do? 4 steps. 4 steps. She's like, how did you figure that out? I'll tell you later, okay? Okay, now, 4 steps we can take to interrupt bias. 4 things we can do to begin to disrupt bias and make sure that we start to bring the unconscious to the conscious and sort of move away. 1 is improved decision making. 2 is counter stereotypical images. 3 is individuating, and 4 is intergroup contact. I'm going to walk through each of them real quickly, then we'll wrap up, okay? Y'all good? You good? Okay. So let's start with improved decision-making. Part of what we know from the science is that we make decisions on a split-second process. We have to slow down. Slow down and be more deliberate, removing discretion and ambiguity from our decision-making. The science tells us when we take our time and are more thoughtful and intentional about who we're engaging and what we think about them, we tend to make more informed choices that are not tied to stereotypes and bias, okay? We see in lots of classrooms, I like teachers who are using have used this for a while, the whole, what's it called? The clothespin approach to make sure they call students fairly that have names on them. When we have examples that force us to be very deliberate and intentional, we do much better in our decision making. So slow down as we make these decisions and not make such quick snap decisions when it comes to how we provide opportunity or access, okay? Number 2, counter stereotypical images. We know, and there's science that proves this out, that the subconscious power of pictures, images, that don't buy into these negative stereotypes work. So this is what I love to see at some of our school sites where we show empowering pictures of women in leadership roles and positions, where we see folks of color who are not in these really sort of negative and sort of backwards sort of notions. The more we can put images and posters and murals in our spaces for all of our students to see themselves reflected in empowering ways and validating ways, that begins to seep into our subconscious, and we are less likely to buy into the stereotypes when our students see that. Does this make sense to folks? Okay. 3rd step we can take is we can start to individuate. Part of what we have to do is that the power of regular one-on-one conversations to see people is a way to break out of the stereotype, okay? Oftentimes we say, I don't like people who are part of group X. How many times have you talked to people in group X? I've never talked to a person from group X. So how do you know how those individuals are? Be intentional to engage with people who are in group X, right? But then folks will say, well, guess what? Some of my best friends are, yeah, it's like, no, don't say that, right? If you can count the folks that you know who are, then that might be a problem, right? So we have to make sure that we take time out to step outside of what's called our cultural comfort zones to actually engage with people who are in set groups that we might have stereotypes about, okay? And folks, let's be honest, one of the things that makes this work hard, because it requires a lot of self-reflection about where did I get this stuff from? Where did it come from? A lot of it's media, but also a lot of it comes from people that we care deeply about. Who am I talking about now? Parents, family, grandparents. Before my grandmother passed away a couple years ago, she was 95 years old, loved my grandmother deeply. But before me and my kids would go visit my grandmother, we would have what I call the pre-talk, okay? And the pre-talk was to tell my children that your granny's gonna say some things that we don't believe, right? And she would start, as soon as we walked in the door, she would go on this group and this group and this group. And many of us have those same family members that are parts of our families. And again, we're trying to unlearn those kinds of depictions of different groups. And the 4th thing, intergroup contact. Again, there's all kinds of data on the power of positive, sustained dialogues across different identity groups, right? So this is why our spaces need to be sort of creative. Part of what disturbs me about so many of the folks who provide service to our parents, yet they have not had sustained conversations with some of our parents. And I don't buy this idea that some of the educators and other service providers say about these parents don't care about their kids' education. First of all, have you ever had a conversation about what these parents do just to get their kids to school every day? Right? If you recognize, if you got parents who are working 2 jobs, sometimes a 3rd job, raising 2 or 3 children by themselves, if you ever recognize that those parents have just as much concern, care, and love and aspiration for their children as we have for ours. But if you've never taken the time out to have that conversation, you allow the stereotype to take hold, right? How can you tell me that a language learner doesn't have the capacity to be successful academically, despite the fact for years, what we have known from the field of linguistics, that individuals who speak more than one language have a certain degree of cognitive dexterity that folks like me who speak one language do not have. So guess who some of our gifted and talented kids are in our districts every single day? Our language learners. But you look at the data, they're rarely represented there, right? It's because we've kind of bought into a stereotype that assumes language learner, slow learner. Yet and still, we don't recognize if you have a conversation with a young 5 or 6-year-old child who's multilingual, sometimes that child is helping to manage their entire households, right? They're the translator with their families for the outside world. They're paying bills. They're applying for jobs. Tell me those kids don't have the gifts and talents to be successful. We just don't recognize their gifts and talents, right? That's where we have to disrupt the stereotypical ways of looking at language learners, poor kids, and the like, okay? So these are steps we can take. I'm gonna get ready to close. So our 2-way strategy solutions, again, unconscious biases affect our judgment and behavior. We need to be intentional about trying to consciously override our biases. Why do I think what I think? What's my experience around that particular population? I need to change that because we can change our implicit associations, but it requires us to be intentional. To look, sometimes it's also something as simple as counting. How many people have we spoken to today and talked to about services? Right? What has been the socioeconomic makeup, right? Do we tend to gravitate toward those families who are most like ours? Those students who have personalities most like mine, right? We have to slow down, be intentional, and be very thoughtful about what we might be doing, okay? We have to increase our racial literacy. That's another part of this, okay? And I want to make the clear distinction that, again, race is not the same as culture, okay? Race is not the same as culture. Someone mentioned this earlier before. Folks, please recognize that you can have 2 people who are the same racial background. Hold your hand up. Hold your hand up. We can be the same racial background, but we can be very different culturally. So we cannot make the assumption that first and foremost that all black folks know each other. We don't know each other, right? We all know each other, right? We don't go to like black meetings and we don't have like a black agenda because like all brown folks don't know each other, right? When we get a new person in my department, they always say, hey, Tyrone, you meet the new person? I say, she must be black because you wouldn't say, do I know him otherwise, right? So, and you can have 2 people who are different racially, hold your hand up, who are different racially, but who can be the same what? Culturally. I maintain that race is the outside, but what we are is cultural beings. It's our cultural stuff that makes us who we are. But we make these associations and assumptions that are based on this without getting to know people. And that's how the biases start to take place. You might be looking at someone who looks very different from you, but has far more in common with you than someone who looks just like you. Okay? That makes sense to folks? And you must stress this point on an ongoing basis. Let me give you a real quick culture test. Okay, my mother had a saying when we were younger. I'm gonna test you guys on this. Some of you get this, some of you won't, okay? Here it goes. My mother had a saying that went like this. When we were young, my mother would say, children are to be seen. Okay, so some of y'all got the same thing, right? Some of the young folks don't know what I was talking about, right? What did that mean? Shut up. Shut up, right? That when we were younger, you could not speak in the presence of adults. And what would happen if you did? They're like, see, I took you back. That just triggered you, right? Some of you went just like this, right? Now, I think this is more generational because today's kids, by and large, will tell you the following. Not only will I be seen, but I will be heard too, right? And there's a cultural disconnect. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of our kids are oftentimes, I think, unjustly punished. Because you have adults who are raised in a time who says that kids are to be seen and not heard. You have today's kids, generally speaking, who believe that, you know what? I believe I'm going to be heard because what we know about millennials, if millennials don't understand why they have to do something, they don't do it, right? They will not do it. I know because I raised 4 of them, right? And look, what was phenomenal to watch is my mother would come to my house and watch me and my wife with our kids. And she used to say, you guys are the softest, weakest parents around, right? Why are you negotiating with your kids about who's going to take out the trash, right? Just tell them take out the trash. But again, many of our millennials will say, if you can't explain to me why I need to do it, and why I need to do it when I need to do it, and how come it benefits me and benefits you, you have to sign a contract to get something simple as just taking out the trash, right? So again, culture and race are not the same. But here's how it manifests itself. Let me get ready to close. I know my time is coming up, okay? As racial microaggressions, folks, that communicate these hostile, derogatory, negative slights. Oftentimes, the perpetrators of the microaggressions are unaware that they're doing and saying things that are harmful, okay? One of the ones I get all the time, a lot of folks in this room can attest, you are so articulate. You got it, right? It's like, okay, what? I went to college. I got a couple degrees. I can put together a sentence with subject and verb and all that stuff, right? But the assumption is for some folks that they're not able to do that. I've seen in many workplaces, folks say, wow, she's a very strong leader to be a woman. Whoa, what does that mean, right? Okay, meant to be a compliment, but oftentimes it's an underhanded dig. Right? And if you hear these comments over time, it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts, where you're constantly questioning yourself, constantly wondering. And it cuts across all social identities. It's not only racial, it can be gendered, and it can be clear. I want to say this because then when you bring it to people's attention, they say, well, you're being super sensitive. Y'all know this, right? Yeah, so just get over it. It was just a joke. I didn't mean it to be harmful. Just because you didn't mean it to be harmful doesn't mean that it's not, okay? I can walk by, tell me your name, please. Elvia, I can walk by Elvia and just step on her toes and crunch them and say, that was an accident, Elvia, but would it still hurt your toes? She said, hell yeah, it will, okay? So the bottom line is, just because you didn't mean to do it doesn't mean that it did not hurt. And there are lots of our children who are victims of microaggressions every day, right? You speak good English. When did you lose your accent? How about I never had an accent, right? When did your country get to this? When did your family get to this country? We were here before your people came here, right? So the argument goes that we have to stop the racial microaggressions because culture matters. Our students live culturally every single day. Again, the question is, do we allow our students to bring their cultural ways of being to the classroom every single day? That's why this work we're doing around trauma-informed care has to be culturally responsive. The culturally relevant, ruler-focused program that Dr. Lester and I have been involved in is recognize that many of our measures do not recognize student culture. It's oftentimes normed off middle-class white men. Last time you checked, I don't see a lot of middle-class white men in our classrooms, in our schools, so we have to be able to respond and make more adjustments to our measures to make sure that they are culturally responsive to the needs of our students. Remember, like I talked about with the restroom, there's not a problem with our young people. It's oftentimes the ways in which the structures and the services are set up that service. And this makes sense to everybody? Okay, let me get ready to wrap up. So what must we do now? We need more trauma-based wellness centers in schools. So Dr. Eduardo, thank you for being like a champion of this work. We need to make sure that our staff are trauma-informed, embrace those children who are in greatest need. That's what equity is about. We're not giving everything to everybody. We're being intentional about those who need more. Cease the pathology around mental health and trauma, okay? We have to begin to stop blaming students and recognize that adverse circumstances are real and our kids are going through them every single day. We also have to make sure that we notice the signs of secondary traumatic stress because we have more. I'm worried about folks in this room. You all see it and feel it every single day. And we see more of our service providers who are taking disability leaves, sick leaves, stress leaves because the work can be heavy. So you must make sure that you take care of yourselves. And community schools must be culturally sustaining and racially literate, making sure that we recognize the nuances of race and culture. Folks, I cannot say enough. Thank you, thank you, thank you for what you do. It matters, it matters, it matters, it matters. You all have been great. Keep up the good work that you're doing, okay?